The moment I stepped through the ballroom doors, 200 Navy SEALs rose to their feet so fast, their chairs scraped against the marble floor like gunfire. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. A commander near the entrance straightened his posture and shouted with the kind of force that rattled crystal chandeliers. "Admiral on deck." And then came the silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. My mother's face drained of color. My younger sister Melanie stood frozen beside her wedding cake, one hand still wrapped around her bouquet. And my father, the same man who had texted me less than 24 hours earlier telling me nobody cared about my Navy career, looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. I wish I could tell you that moment felt good. For 30 years I'd imagined some version of it. Some moment where people who dismissed me would finally understand who I'd become. But standing there in my white dress uniform with 4 stars on my shoulders, all I really felt was tired. Tired enough to realize revenge rarely arrives the way you imagine it. The strange thing about humiliation is that it ages with you. I was 58 years old standing in a Charleston ballroom, yet part of me still felt like the skinny 17-year-old girl sitting at my parents' dinner table, while my father praised my little sister for being sweet and criticized me for being difficult. Back then, Melanie could do no wrong. She was homecoming queen. Church choir. Beautiful smile. Perfect manners. And me? I was the girl who asked too many questions. The girl who wanted to join ROTC. The girl who talked about aircraft carriers instead of weddings. My father used to laugh whenever I mentioned the military. "Claire," he'd say, "women don't belong on warships." That was in 1985. I remember because Ronald Reagan was still president, and my mother was cooking meatloaf when I announced I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. Melanie nearly choked, laughing. My father folded his newspaper slowly and looked at me like I'd embarrassed him. "You'll grow out of this phase." But I didn't. If anything, the Navy became the one place where people finally stopped asking me to shrink myself. At Annapolis, nobody cared whether I smiled enough. Nobody cared whether I looked pretty at church socials. They cared whether I could lead, whether I could endure, whether I could stay calm when things got hard. Turns out I could, though my family never quite forgave me for it. Over the years, our phone calls became shorter. Birthdays forgotten. Holidays missed because I was deployed. My father once introduced me to a neighbor by saying, "This is our daughter Claire. She works for the government." Works for the government. At the time, I'd already commanded thousands of sailors. But I smiled politely because after a while disappointment becomes routine. 3 days before Melanie's wedding, I was sitting inside my office at Naval Station Norfolk reviewing retirement paperwork when my phone buzzed. "Dad." I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken properly in months. Instead, I opened the message. "No one cares about your Navy career. Please don't embarrass us by wearing that uniform to Melanie's wedding." I stared at the screen a long time. Outside my office window, gray Atlantic rain hammered against the pier. Young sailors hurried between buildings with their collars turned up against the wind. I remember feeling strangely hollow. Not angry. Not surprised. Just tired. After all those years, my father still believed my service was something shameful, something attention-seeking. I set the phone down carefully. Then I laughed once. A quiet laugh. Because by then I'd spent more than 3 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure, and somehow a text message from an 80-year-old man still had the power to hurt me more than enemy fire ever had. That evening I nearly decided not to go. I poured myself a glass of bourbon in my Norfolk townhouse and sat alone in the quiet. No husband. No children. That part of my life had slipped away somewhere between deployments and promotions. David, my ex-husband, used to say the Navy always came first. At the time, I denied it. Now I wasn't so sure. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Ramon Hayes. Master Chief Ramon Hayes. Retired SEAL. One of the best men I'd ever served beside. "Tell me you're still going to Charleston," he said immediately. "How'd you hear about that?" "Claire, half the East Coast defense community's invited to this wedding. Word travels." I sighed. "I'm thinking maybe I should stay home." There was silence on the line for a second. Then Ramon spoke softly. You spent 30 years standing your post for people who never thanked you. Don't start hiding now. That hit harder than I expected. Ramon had seen me during some of the ugliest years of my career. He'd seen me after casualty notifications, after buried friends, after impossible decisions. If he thought I should go, maybe I needed to listen. You really think it matters? I asked. No, he said, I think you matter. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I pulled my full white dress uniform from the garment bag hanging in my closet. Gold buttons polished. Sleeve stripes immaculate. 4 silver stars waiting on the shoulders. I ran my hand across the fabric slowly. People imagine uniforms make you feel powerful. Sometimes they just remind you how much life they cost. By noon I was driving south toward Charleston in my black sedan with old jazz playing softly through the speakers. The highway stretched endlessly beneath gray Carolina skies. Billboards. Gas stations. Church signs. Tiny southern towns where American flags fluttered outside hardware stores. The kind of places where people still say sir and ma'am. By the time I reached Charleston, evening sunlight had turned the harbor gold. The wedding venue sat along the waterfront like something out of a magazine. White columns, enormous oak trees, strings of lights swaying in the breeze. Valet attendants hurried between luxury cars. Women in pastel dresses laughed beneath champagne tents. And suddenly, at 58 years old, I felt like an unwanted teenager again. I checked into my hotel quietly under my maiden name. The receptionist recognized me from television almost immediately, but was polite enough not to mention it loudly. That night my mother called. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to say she missed me. Just one sentence. Please try not to upset your father tomorrow. I stared at the hotel window overlooking Charleston Harbor after she hung up. Somewhere out there, Navy ships cut through black Atlantic water beneath the dark. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit something painful. No matter how many medals sat on my chest. Part of me still wanted my parents to be proud of me. I arrived at the wedding venue early the next afternoon because old military habits die hard. 15 minutes early had been drilled into me since my plebe year at Annapolis. Even after all these years, I still couldn't bring myself to arrive fashionably late like civilians seemed to enjoy doing. The Charleston air was warm and heavy with salt from the harbor. White folding chairs lined the lawn overlooking the water, and a string quartet played softly beneath enormous live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was beautiful. Melanie always had a talent for beautiful things. Beautiful clothes, beautiful homes, beautiful friendships that looked effortless. Growing up, she could walk into a room and instantly belong there. I always felt like I was studying the room instead. A young valet opened my car door. The moment he saw the 4 stars on my shoulders, his expression changed completely. Good afternoon, ma'am. His posture straightened automatically. I nodded politely and handed him the keys. The reaction wasn't unusual. Military people noticed details civilians overlooked. But the wedding guests gathered outside the venue barely looked at me at all. To them, I was simply an older woman in uniform. Maybe a ceremonial escort. Maybe somebody hired for the event. I carried myself quietly toward the entrance heels, clicking against the stone walkway. Then I saw my mother. Barbara Bennett stood near the reception tent, wearing a pale blue dress and pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. Her smile appeared instantly when she noticed me, but it never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Claire," she said softly, glancing around nervously, "you really wore it." I looked down at my uniform. "Yes, Mom, I did." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's just, this day is supposed to be about Melanie." There it was. Same song, different decade. I kept my tone calm. "I'm attending my sister's wedding respectfully." "Yes, but people might misunderstand." I almost laughed. People misunderstand women in uniform all the time. But before I could answer, my father approached. Harold Bennett still carried himself like the high school football coach he'd once been. Even at 80, he moved with stiff authority, though age had curved his shoulders and softened his hair into thin silver. The moment his eyes landed on my uniform, his jaw tightened. "You actually did it." "Good to see you too, Dad." He ignored that. "You couldn't let Melanie have one day?" I stared at him in disbelief. "I'm standing here quietly." "You know exactly what you're doing," he muttered. That hurt more than I expected. Because the truth was, I had spent my entire adult life trying not to make my family uncomfortable with my success. I changed subjects during holidays, avoided discussing promotions, never corrected them when they minimized my career. And still somehow my existence felt offensive to them. My father leaned closer. You could have worn a normal dress. Normal. I'd heard that word my whole life. Why can't you be normal? Why can't you settle down? Why can't you stop trying to prove something? Before I could respond, Melanie appeared. She looked stunning in her wedding gown. For a moment I saw the little girl who used to follow me around the backyard when we were children. Her expression softened when she hugged me. I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it. Then she stepped back and awkwardness returned to her face. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. Would you maybe consider taking off some of the medals during the reception? I blinked slowly. The medals. They just draw attention. I looked at my little sister standing there in diamonds and lace, still afraid of sharing space with me after all these years. And suddenly I didn't feel angry. Just sad. I earned these, Melanie. I know, she said quickly. I'm not trying to be mean. I know. But she was. Not intentionally, perhaps. Still, the message was clear. Shrink yourself. Again. Before the conversation could continue, wedding guests began arriving in larger groups. Luxury sedans rolled up one after another. Men in tailored suits. Women carrying expensive handbags. Politicians. Business owners. Retired officers. Charleston society. I quietly moved toward the back rows near the water, hoping to avoid further tension. That's when I noticed the first change in atmosphere. A gray-haired man across the lawn froze mid-conversation, staring directly at me. Then another. Whispers began spreading subtly through the crowd. At first I assumed they recognized the uniform itself. High-ranking military dress attire attracts attention, especially in formal settings. But then a retired captain I'd worked with years earlier approached carefully. Admiral Bennett. I smiled politely. Captain Morris, been a long time. Yes, ma'am. The ma'am came instantly, almost reflexively. Nearby guests overheard. Heads began turning. Within minutes, more former service members started recognizing me. Some approached respectfully. Others simply nodded from across the lawn. One older Marine colonel placed his hand over his heart briefly before returning to his seat. I could feel my parents watching all of it uneasily. My father especially. For him, this was unfamiliar territory. At home in Charleston, he was the respected man. The center of attention. The authority. But here among military circles, that authority belonged to me. The ceremony itself began beautifully enough. Sunlight danced across the harbor while vows were exchanged beneath white roses. I stayed quiet in the back row. Clapped politely. Smiled when appropriate. Tried not to think about how emotionally exhausting the afternoon already felt. Afterward, guests moved into the grand ballroom for the reception. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Servers carried trays of champagne. A jazz band played old standards near the dance floor. I deliberately chose a small table near the rear corner of the room. Far from the family. Far from attention. Or so I thought. A few minutes later, a young Navy lieutenant approached my table nervously. Excuse me, ma'am. Yes. I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you. He couldn't have been older than 25. Fresh-faced? Sharp uniform. Probably reminded me of myself once. Thank you, Lieutenant. My father served under you in Afghanistan. That caught me off guard. What's his name? Senior Chief Daniel Mercer. I smiled immediately. Mercer survived because of your evacuation order, the lieutenant said quietly. My family never forgot that. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Before I could answer, another officer approached. Then another. Across the ballroom, I noticed groups of military guests beginning to notice the gathering around my table. Recognition spread visibly now. A retired SEAL commander near the entrance suddenly stood upright. His eyes widened, and then everything changed. Chairs scraped backward across marble floors, one after another. Then dozens more. Until 200 hardened SEALs rose to their feet all at once. The sound hit first. Not voices. Not applause. Just the violent scrape of chairs against marble as 200 men rose at the exact same moment. Every instinct inside me immediately recognized military discipline at work. The ballroom froze. Conversations stopped so abruptly that even the jazz band faltered into silence mid-song. I remained seated for half a second, stunned. Then a commander near the ballroom entrance squared his shoulders and bellowed with the kind of authority that once carried across aircraft carrier flight decks. "Admiral on deck." Every military guest snapped to attention. Some civilians stood awkwardly without understanding why. Others simply stared. I slowly rose from my chair. The room became utterly silent. I'd heard that command thousands of times in my life, on ships, at ceremonies, during inspections, in war zones where rank and order meant survival. But hearing it there in my sister's Charleston wedding reception while my parents stood speechless 20 feet away felt surreal. For one strange moment it was as though my two separate lives had collided. The daughter who was never enough, and the admiral who commanded fleets. The commander nearest me held his salute. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." A faint smile tugged at my mouth despite myself. "You always did anyway, Commander." A few quiet laughs rippled through the military crowd, easing the tension slightly. Then I recognized him fully. Commander Nate Holloway. Former SEAL team leader? Last time I'd seen him was overseas nearly 15 years earlier after a disastrous extraction operation in Kandahar. His hair was grayer now, face older. But his eyes carried the same sharp steadiness. "It's good to see you, Admiral Bennett," he said quietly. "You too, Nate." Behind him stood row after row of current and former SEALs officers, chiefs, enlisted sailors, Marines, and defense personnel. Some I recognized immediately. Others had aged enough that I needed a second glance. Yet every face carried the same expression. Respect. Real respect. Not the shallow kind people show powerful individuals because they want something. This was different. This came from shared hardship, shared sacrifice. Across the ballroom, I finally looked toward my parents. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father stood perfectly still beside her, his face pale beneath the ballroom lights. He looked genuinely confused, as though he couldn't reconcile the daughter he'd spent decades dismissing with the reaction unfolding around him. Melanie looked overwhelmed, more than angry now. The groom Ethan leaned toward her, whispering something urgently while glancing at me with obvious astonishment. Then an older man approached through the crowd. Tall, silver-haired, expensive Navy suit. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Whitaker, former Navy officer turned defense executive worth more money than most small towns. Also Ethan's father. He stopped directly in front of me and extended his hand warmly. "Admiral Bennett," he said, "I had no idea you were Melanie's sister." "That makes two of us," I answered before I could stop myself. To my surprise, Whitaker laughed softly. "Well," he said, "this explains why half the military guests suddenly forgot there's a wedding happening." Even I smiled at that. Whitaker turned toward the room. "For those of you civilians wondering what's happening," he announced calmly, "you're looking at Rear Admiral Claire Bennett, one of the most respected operational leaders this country's produced in the last 20 years. Murmurs spread immediately. I felt my stomach tighten. I never enjoyed public praise. After enough years in leadership, attention becomes exhausting. But there was no stopping it now. A retired SEAL near the back raised his glass. "She brought our boys home." Another voice answered. "Damn right she did." Then another. "Saved my unit in Helmand." A man I barely recognized stepped forward slowly. His left leg carried a noticeable limp. When he spoke, emotion roughened his voice. "You wrote letters to every one of our families after Red River." The room quieted again. I remembered him then. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dean. We'd lost 4 men during Operation Red River. Worst night of my career. Dean stopped directly in front of me. "You sat with my wife for 6 hours after they told us Tommy didn't make it," he said quietly. "Most commanders send paperwork. You stayed." I swallowed hard. Some memories never loosen their grip. "That's what leaders are supposed to do," I answered softly. "No, ma'am," Dean replied. "That's what good people do." For a moment I couldn't speak. Around us, even civilians seemed moved now. The room no longer felt judgmental. It felt human. And strangely enough, that made everything harder. Because standing there surrounded by all that respect, all I could think about was how badly I'd wanted even a fraction of it from my own family. Whitaker gently motioned toward the head table. "Admiral, would you honor us by joining the family seating?" Before I could answer, my father finally found his voice. "Yes," he said quickly. "Of course she should sit with family." The sudden change almost made me laugh. 2 hours earlier, he'd wanted me invisible. Now he looked desperate to claim me publicly. I walked toward the head table slowly. Guests parted instinctively to make room. Some shook my hand. Others thanked me for my service. One elderly woman touched my arm and whispered, "My grandson made it home because of women like you." I thanked her quietly. When I finally reached the table, my father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother looked emotional enough to cry. Melanie stared at me carefully. Not with jealousy anymore. Something closer to confusion. As if she'd suddenly realized she never actually knew me. Dinner resumed awkwardly. Conversation slowly returned. But the energy in the ballroom had changed permanently. Now people approached our table constantly. Military officers, business leaders, politicians, all wanting to speak with me. My father sat quietly through most of it, listening while strangers described accomplishments he'd never bothered learning about. At one point, an older senator shook my hand firmly. "Your Gulf evacuation strategy saved American lives," he said. "Washington still talks about that operation." My father looked at me sharply. "You planned military evacuations?" I nodded once. "Yes, Dad." He stared down at the tablecloth. A long silence followed. Finally, almost quietly enough to miss, he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us you were this important?" That question landed harder than any insult ever had. I looked at the man who'd spent 30 years reducing my entire life to works for the government. Then I answered honestly, "You never wanted to know." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my entire life, my father had absolutely nothing to say. After dinner, the reception finally settled back into something resembling a normal wedding. The jazz band resumed playing. Guests drifted toward the dance floor. Servers carried slices of wedding cake between tables, while the Charleston harbor shimmered black beyond the ballroom windows. But everywhere I walked, people kept stopping me. Former sailors, retired Marines, defense contractors, widows of servicemen. Each conversation carried pieces of a life I rarely spoke about outside military circles. A retired chief introduced me to his granddaughter attending Annapolis next year. One former corpsman hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. Another man simply shook my hand silently with tears in his eyes. That one stayed with me. War leaves echoes in people, especially after enough years. Around 9 o'clock, I finally slipped outside for air. The noise of the ballroom faded behind me as I walked toward the marina beside the venue. Charleston Harbor stretched dark and calm beneath the moonlight. Boats rocked gently against wooden docks while warm coastal wind moved through the palmetto trees. For the first time all evening, I could breathe. I leaned against the railing and loosened one white glove slowly. "Mind if I join you, Admiral?" I turned and smiled faintly. Ramon Hayes approached carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. "About time you showed up," I said. "Traffic. That's your excuse for everything." He handed me a glass. Ramon had retired from the SEALs 6 years earlier after multiple surgeries finally forced him out. Even now, he moved carefully, favoring one knee during cold weather. We stood side by side, overlooking the water in comfortable silence. "You handled that circus pretty well," he finally said. "I've survived congressional hearings. Weddings are nothing." He laughed quietly. Then his expression softened. "You okay?" That question nearly broke me. Because underneath the polished uniform and decades of leadership training, part of me still felt emotionally raw from seeing my parents' faces inside that ballroom. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. Ramon nodded like he understood completely. "That's the trouble with family," he said. "Strangers can wound you. Family can convince you the wound belongs there." I stared across the harbor lights. "You know the ridiculous part, I'm 58 years old, and I still wanted my father to look proud of me. That never goes away." "Number?" "Nope." He took a sip of bourbon. "My old man hugged me once in his entire life. I remember the date better than my wedding anniversary. I laughed softly at that. Then footsteps approached behind us. I turned expecting another guest. Instead, it was Melanie. Still in her wedding gown. Still carrying that careful expression people wear when approaching emotional landmines. I hope I'm not interrupting. Ramon immediately stepped back politely. I'll give you ladies a minute. Once he disappeared toward the ballroom, Melanie joined me at the railing. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she exhaled slowly. I owe you an apology. I remained quiet. When I asked you to remove your medals, she looked down. That was wrong. It wasn't about the medals. No, she admitted, it wasn't. The harbor wind moved loose strands of hair across her face. You know what's awful, she said quietly. I spent most of my life thinking Mom and Dad loved me more because I was somehow better than you. I looked at her carefully. But tonight I realized something. What? They never understood you enough to appreciate you. That hurt because it was true. Melanie's eyes glistened. You were always the brave one, Claire. I almost smiled. You say that now? No, I should have said it years ago. She leaned both hands against the railing beside me. When you left for Annapolis, Mom cried for a week. Dad kept saying you'd fail and come home. I remember. But every promotion you got after that? She shook her head slowly. It scared them. Why? Because you became someone bigger than the life they understood. I looked out toward the dark Atlantic beyond the harbor. Maybe she was right. Small-town Southern families sometimes know how to celebrate familiar success. Marriage. Children. Local respectability. But ambition that carries someone far away can feel threatening. Especially when it changes the family structure itself. Melanie touched my arm gently. For what it's worth, she whispered, I was always proud to tell people my sister was in the Navy. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Thank you. We stood together quietly after that. For the first time in decades, the competition between us felt gone. Not healed completely, but softened. Then my mother appeared outside the ballroom doors. Her mascara had smudged slightly. She looked smaller somehow. Older. Claire, she said softly, could we talk? Melanie squeezed my hand once before walking away. My mother approached carefully like she feared I might disappear if she moved too quickly. I owe you an apology too, she said immediately. I stayed silent. She looked down at her hands. I didn't understand your life. I think maybe I chose the easier daughter. The honesty stunned me. Melanie needed me differently, she continued. You always seemed so strong. I let out a tired breath. That's the problem with strong daughters, Mom. People think they don't need kindness. Tears filled her eyes instantly. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me completely. I used to keep newspaper clippings about your promotions, she admitted quietly. Your father didn't know. I stared at her. What? They're in my dresser drawer at home. That image nearly shattered me. My mother secretly saving pieces of my life while pretending indifference for years. Why do families do this to each other? Why do people who love one another waste so much time withholding it? Before I could answer, another voice spoke behind us. Barbara. My father. He stood near the ballroom doors looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. My mother quietly touched my arm and walked back inside, leaving us alone. Dad approached slowly toward the marina railing. The harbor wind moved through his silver hair. For several seconds he simply stared out at the water beside me. Then he spoke without looking at me. I was drafted in 1967. That caught me completely off guard. You never told me that. No, his jaw tightened, because your grandfather made some calls, kept me from serving. I frowned slightly. Dad swallowed hard. I spent my whole life pretending that didn't bother me. And suddenly pieces began fitting together. My father kept staring out across Charleston Harbor like the answer to his entire life might be floating somewhere in the dark water. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he laughed once. Not happily. More like a man finally exhausted from carrying something too heavy for too long. Your grandfather knew people, he said quietly. Important people, county judges, politicians, men who owed favors. The wind moved softly against the marina docks beneath us. When my draft notice came, he paused. He made sure I never went to Vietnam. I studied him carefully. Growing up, my father had always carried himself like the toughest man in any room, confident, certain, loud when necessary. But standing there now, he looked smaller somehow. Human. I always told people I had a knee problem, he continued. Truth is, I was healthy as a horse. I didn't interrupt. Back then, I convinced myself I was lucky. He swallowed. Then boys I grew up with started coming home in boxes. Pain roughened his voice on the last word. My best friend Tommy Walker died outside Da Nang in '68. We played football together since middle school. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I remember standing at his funeral while everybody called him a hero. His eyes remained fixed on the harbor, and all I could think was, that should have been me over there. The pieces finally clicked together inside my mind. His resentment. His discomfort around military service. His hostility toward my career. It had never truly been about me. It was shame. A lifetime of it. I spent 40 years trying not to think about Vietnam, he admitted quietly. Then my daughter joins the Navy and becomes everything I was too scared to become myself. I let out a slow breath. You could have told me. How he snapped suddenly. How exactly was I supposed to say that? The old temper flashed briefly before fading again. I didn't even know how to admit it to myself. Silence settled between us. Somewhere behind us inside the ballroom, guests laughed while the band played old Frank Sinatra songs. Normal life continuing. Meanwhile, my father stood unraveling decades of buried guilt beside a dark marina. I thought if I minimized your career, he whispered, maybe I wouldn't feel so ashamed of mine. That one hurt. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. I leaned both hands against the railing. You know what's strange, Dad?
What?
I spent my entire life thinking you were disappointed in me. He looked at me finally then. Deep regret filled his face. Claire, he said quietly, I never stopped being proud of you. The words hit me so hard I nearly looked away. Because they arrived about 30 years too late. You had a funny way of showing it. I know. He nodded immediately. I know that now. For a moment I saw not the intimidating father from my childhood, but simply an old man carrying regrets he could no longer outrun. Age does that to people. Eventually life strips away enough pride that honesty becomes easier than pretending. Dad cleared his throat roughly. When you left for Annapolis, I told everybody you'd quit after one semester. I smiled faintly. I remember. But every time you proved me wrong, he shook his head slowly. I'd secretly brag about you at work. I blinked. What? Oh, I never told you. He gave a weak laugh. But I kept your newspaper articles in my desk drawer. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my chest. All those years. All those wasted years. I didn't understand your world, he admitted. Truth is, I think it scared me. I stared out at the water again. When I commanded my first destroyer, I said softly, I was terrified every single day for 6 months. Dad looked surprised. You. Yes, me? You never looked scared. That's leadership. A small smile touched his face for the first time all evening. Then he asked quietly, did it cost you a lot, the Navy? That question carried more compassion than anything he'd asked me in years. I thought about David. The miscarriage during deployment. Missed anniversaries. Buried friends. The loneliness of command. Yes, I answered honestly, it cost a lot. Dad nodded slowly like he finally understood something important. You know, he said your mother used to sit by the television during Desert Storm waiting for updates. Pretended she wasn't worried. He smiled faintly, but every time your name came on screen she'd cry afterward. I looked down at my white gloves resting against the railing. Families are complicated creatures. Sometimes love hides beneath layers of fear, pride, resentment, and misunderstanding, until nobody remembers how to express it properly anymore. Around 10:30 guests began leaving the reception. The music softened. Valets brought cars around front. Inside the ballroom, staff cleared champagne glasses while Melanie and Ethan prepared for their final send-off. Dad shifted awkwardly beside me. I know I can't fix everything tonight. No, I agreed gently, you can't. He nodded once. But I'd like to try. For the first time in decades, I believed him. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. My hotel room overlooked Charleston Harbor, glowing pale gold beneath early morning light. Cargo ships moved slowly across the water while gulls circled above the docks. I dressed quietly in civilian clothes for the drive back to Norfolk. No uniform today. Just jeans, loafers, and a navy sweater. By 7 o'clock I was downstairs checking out when the front desk clerk smiled nervously. "There's someone waiting for you outside, Admiral Bennett." I stepped through the hotel doors, expecting perhaps Ramon. Instead, my father stood beside his old Buick holding a worn cardboard box. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he held the box toward me awkwardly. "Your mother wanted you to have these." I opened it carefully. Inside sat dozens of letters. My letters. Every letter I'd mailed home from Annapolis during my academy years. Some still carried creases from being folded and unfolded repeatedly. My throat tightened instantly. "She kept all of them," I whispered. Dad nodded. "I read them last night." He looked exhausted, older than I'd ever seen him. Then he reached into the box and pulled out one envelope carefully. There was one line. His voice cracked slightly. One line I can't stop thinking about. He handed me the letter. I recognized my own 18-year-old handwriting immediately. Dad swallowed hard. "You wrote..." He paused. "I hope someday Dad will finally be proud of me." Emotion hit both of us at once. His eyes reddened visibly. "I was proud the whole time," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to say it." I looked at the old man standing before me. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. Melanie arrived a few minutes later carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches for the drive. She hugged me tightly before I left. "No more disappearing for months at a time," she warned gently. "I'll try." As I pulled onto the highway north, Charleston disappeared slowly behind me beneath soft Carolina morning light. And somewhere between the harbor and the interstate, I realized something unexpected. The greatest victory of my life wasn't becoming an admiral. It was finally understanding I no longer needed anyone's permission to know my own worth. A few hours later, I stopped at a small airport cafe near Norfolk. While waiting for coffee, a nervous young woman in Navy recruit sweats recognized me immediately. Her eyes widened. "Admiral Bennett." I smiled softly. "That's me." The young recruit straightened awkwardly and offered an uncertain salute. I returned it warmly. And suddenly, for the first time in years, the future felt lighter than the past. If this story touched something in your heart, maybe share it with someone who spent too many years feeling unseen. And if you've ever struggled to hear the words, "I'm proud of you," remember this. Sometimes people love us long before they learn how to say it. Thank you for listening. Help me get revenge. Those were the last words I ever expected to hear from my grandmother. Not because she was weak. Not because she couldn't stand up for herself. But because Margaret Mitchell was the strongest person I had ever known. At 78 years old, she was the kind of woman people stood up for when she entered a room. Veterans saluted her. Neighbors brought her pies at Christmas. Local politicians asked her to speak at Memorial Day ceremonies. She had spent 23 years serving as a Navy nurse. She had spent the next 30 helping everyone else. And yet there she was, sitting alone in her kitchen, crying, while my own parents sat in the next room dividing up her life. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. At the time this happened, I had just finished a training assignment in Virginia that ended 3 days earlier than expected. Instead of waiting around at the base, I decided to drive home to Ohio and surprise Grandma. I hadn't seen her in almost 4 months. We talked on the phone every Sunday, but it wasn't the same. Grandma had practically raised me. After my grandfather died, my parents were always busy working, chasing promotions, worrying about money. Grandma was the one who attended my school plays. Grandma taught me how to ride a bike. Grandma sat beside my hospital bed when I broke my arm at 12. And Grandma was the person who inspired me to join the Navy. I figured she'd be thrilled to see me. I never imagined what I was about to walk into. The driveway was crowded when I arrived. My father's truck was there. My mother's SUV. My Uncle Ray's old Ford pickup. That was unusual. Nobody had mentioned a family gathering. I parked and walked toward the front porch. As I approached the house, I heard voices coming through an open window. Loud voices, arguing voices. I recognized Uncle Ray immediately. "We should sell the place before winter." My father replied, "That's exactly what I'm saying." I stopped walking. Something about the conversation felt wrong. Then Ray laughed. We can probably get 400 grand for the house alone. My stomach tightened. The house? What house? Grandma's house? I moved closer. My mother's voice joined in. And her savings account isn't bad either. I froze. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. Then my father spoke again. Once she's in assisted living, she won't need most of it anyway. I felt a flash of anger so sudden it almost made me dizzy. Assisted living. What were they talking about? Grandma was 78, not 98. She still drove herself to church, still volunteered at the Veterans Center, still shoveled her own sidewalk when it snowed. Nobody had mentioned assisted living. Nobody. I pushed open the front door. The voices stopped instantly. 3 startled faces turned toward me. Sarah, my mother said. What are you doing here? I looked at each of them. Nobody smiled. Nobody looked happy to see me. Instead, they looked uncomfortable. Caught. Training ended early, I said. My father forced a laugh. Well, that's a surprise. I glanced at the papers spread across the coffee table. Property estimates, financial statements, real estate brochures. None of them belonged there. Where's Grandma? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. That told me everything. Finally, my mother pointed toward the kitchen. She's back there. Oh, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, alone. A mug of coffee sat untouched in front of her. The moment I saw her face, my heart broke. Her eyes were red. Her shoulders slumped. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone had taken a piece of her. Grandma. She looked up. For a second she seemed confused. Then recognition appeared, and she smiled. The kind of smile people give when they're trying not to cry. Sarah. I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around her. The second I did, she broke down. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quiet tears. The kind that hurt the most. I held her while anger burned through me. Nobody deserved this, especially not her. After several minutes, she finally pulled away. I'm sorry, she said. You have nothing to apologize for. She nodded toward the living room. They've been here all morning. I already knew who she meant. What happened? Grandma stared into her coffee. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she spoke softly. They think I'm becoming a burden. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A burden. She gave a sad smile. They say they're worried about me. The words dripped with disappointment. Not bitterness. Disappointment. That somehow felt worse. I walked toward the living room. I was ready to throw every one of them out of the house. Maybe call the police. Maybe call a lawyer. Maybe both. But before I reached the doorway, a hand closed around my wrist. I looked down. Grandma. For such a small woman, her grip was surprisingly firm. Don't. I stared at her. Grandma. Please. I could see something in her eyes. Not fear. Not weakness. Something else. Something calculating. Something I hadn't seen in years. The same look she used to get when telling stories about difficult days in the Navy. The look of someone thinking 3 steps ahead. I sat back down. What is it? She glanced toward the living room to make sure nobody was listening. Then she leaned closer. So close I could barely hear her whisper. They don't know. I frowned. They don't know what. A faint smile appeared. The first genuine smile I'd seen all day. Then she whispered the words that would change everything. Help me get revenge. I stared at her in shock. Grandma! Revenge. The woman who spent her life teaching forgiveness. The woman who volunteered every Christmas morning. The woman who never said a cruel word about anyone. She squeezed my hand. I don't mean what you think. Then what do you mean? She looked toward the ceiling. Toward the attic. Toward a place I hadn't thought about in years. There is something up there. What? Her eyes met mine. The old military footlocker. I remembered it instantly. An old Navy trunk Grandpa had stored decades ago. Nobody ever opened it. Nobody. Grandma lowered her voice again. They think they know everything. Her smile grew slightly, but they forgot who I am. Then she pointed toward the attic stairs. Help me bring it down. And for the first time that day, I realized my grandmother wasn't defeated. Not even close. She was preparing for battle. And whatever was inside that footlocker, my parents and uncle had absolutely no idea it existed. For the next 20 minutes, I played the role of a Navy officer conducting a covert operation inside her own grandmother's house. Not because anyone was dangerous, but because Grandma insisted. Wait until they're distracted, she whispered. I couldn't help smiling. There was something almost familiar about this version of her. The woman sitting in that kitchen wasn't the fragile, elderly widow my parents seemed to see. This was Lieutenant Margaret Mitchell, retired, but not defeated. The opportunity came when my mother announced she was making coffee. A few minutes later, my father and Uncle Ray followed her into the backyard to discuss real estate listings. Grandma nodded toward the hallway. Now, I climbed the attic stairs while she waited below. The old house creaked beneath my feet. I hadn't been up there since high school. Dust covered everything. Boxes filled with decades of family history lined the walls. Christmas decorations, old furniture, photo albums. And there, exactly where I remembered it, sat the footlocker, a faded navy blue military trunk. The metal corners were scratched. The lock was worn, but it still looked solid enough to survive another century. I carried it downstairs carefully. When I set it on the kitchen floor, Grandma ran her hand across the lid. For a moment, her expression softened, almost as if she were greeting an old friend. "I haven't opened this in years," she said quietly. Then she reached into her pocket. A small brass key appeared. The lock clicked open. I expected money, or legal documents, or maybe evidence against my parents. What I found was something completely different. Letters, hundreds of letters, photographs, military records, awards, certificates, newspaper clippings, and memories. An entire lifetime packed into a single trunk. Grandma lifted the first photograph. A young woman in a Navy uniform smiled back at us. Dark hair, confident eyes, perfect posture. I almost didn't recognize her. "You were beautiful," she laughed. Past tense, I laughed too, for the first time all day. Still beautiful. Smart answer. We spent the next hour going through the contents. Every item revealed another piece of her life. A Navy Commendation Medal, a Meritorious Service Medal, letters from wounded sailors, photographs from military hospitals, thank you notes from families. I picked up one yellowed envelope. The paper felt fragile. The handwriting belonged to a man named James Carter. Inside was a letter dated 42 years earlier. I began reading aloud. "Dear Lieutenant Mitchell." The letter described a young sailor who had been seriously injured overseas. During recovery, he became depressed and nearly gave up hope. According to the letter, Grandma visited him every day, encouraged him, listened to him, refused to let him quit. Years later, he became a teacher, then a principal, then a grandfather. The final sentence made me stop. If you hadn't believed in me, I wouldn't have survived long enough to meet my grandchildren. I looked up. Grandma shrugged. He was a good man. I stared at her. Most people would frame a letter like that. She had stuffed it into a box and forgotten about it. The deeper we searched, the more stories emerged. There were dozens of letters, maybe hundreds. Each one told a similar story. Lives changed. Families saved. People helped. None of which I'd ever heard before. "Why didn't you tell anyone about this?" She smiled. "Because it wasn't about me." That answer perfectly captured who she was. Then we found another folder. This one contained financial records. I assumed they were ordinary bank statements. They weren't. I started recognizing names. My father, my uncle, several cousins. The amounts shocked me. $5,000, $12,000, $20,000, $35,000. Loan after loan, year after year. Most were marked paid by Margaret. Never repaid, never mentioned, never discussed. I looked at Grandma. "They borrowed all this?" She nodded. "They needed help." My jaw tightened. "Did they ever pay you back?" A small smile appeared. "You already know the answer." I did. Suddenly, pieces of my childhood started fitting together. The summer my parents almost lost their house. Grandma helped. The year my uncle's business failed. Grandma helped. The medical bills. The car repairs. The college tuition. Grandma helped. Again, and again, and again, while somehow managing to build a life of her own. The realization made me angry. Not because she had been generous, because they had forgotten. "Do they know how much you've done for them?" I asked. Grandma considered the question. At one time, yes, and now, she looked toward the living room. "I think people sometimes rewrite history when gratitude becomes inconvenient." The words hit hard, because they were true. A few minutes later, she handed me a worn leather journal. "This matters more than the money." I opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten entries spanning decades, notes about family, lessons from military service, personal reflections. The handwriting remained neat and disciplined throughout. One entry caught my attention. It had been written shortly after my grandfather died. I read silently. Today I learned that grief and responsibility can occupy the same room. I miss him terribly. But the children still need me, so tomorrow I will get up and continue. I swallowed hard. Grandma had never stopped continuing. Not once. The more we talked, the more I understood why her tears hurt so much. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was betrayal. She had spent a lifetime sacrificing for others. Now the people she loved most were treating her like an obstacle standing between them and an inheritance. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me all afternoon. What did you mean when you asked for revenge? Grandma sat quietly for several moments. Then she folded her hands. I don't want to hurt them. I waited. I don't want them humiliated. Another pause. I don't even want them punished. Now I was confused. Then what do you want? Her eyes met mine, the same steady eyes that had guided patients through fear and uncertainty for decades. The truth. The truth, she nodded. They've spent years convincing themselves they're good people. Her voice remained calm. I want them to see what they've become. The kitchen fell silent. Outside I could hear my father laughing. Uncle Ray was saying something about property taxes. Neither had any idea what was happening inside. Grandma reached into the footlocker one final time. This time she removed a thick sealed envelope. Unlike everything else, it looked recent. Very recent. She placed it in my hands. What's this? Her smile returned. A mysterious smile. The kind that immediately made me curious. Something they definitely don't know about. I looked at the envelope, then back at her. For the first time all day, excitement replaced my anger. Because whatever was inside that envelope, it was important enough for Grandma to keep hidden, and important enough to make her believe the truth could still win. I stared at the sealed envelope for several seconds. It wasn't thick. It wasn't marked confidential. There was nothing dramatic about it. Just a plain manila envelope with my grandmother's handwriting across the front. For Sarah. Nothing else. No explanation. No warning. No clues. Yet somehow it felt more important than everything else we'd found inside the footlocker. Open it, Grandma said. I slid a finger beneath the seal. Inside were several documents. At first glance, they looked like ordinary legal papers. Then I started reading, and suddenly I understood why Grandma had smiled. The first document belonged to a lawyer in Columbus. The second belonged to an accountant. The third established something called the Margaret Mitchell Veterans Service Foundation. I looked up. The what? Grandma folded her hands. The foundation. You started a foundation. 5 years ago. I blinked. 5 years. She nodded. I couldn't believe it. My parents talked to her constantly. My uncle visited every month. How could none of them know? Then again, maybe they hadn't been paying attention. I continued reading. The foundation's purpose was simple. Support veterans, provide emergency assistance, fund scholarships for military families, help elderly veterans remain independent in their homes. The organization already existed. Legally, fully funded, fully operational. I flipped through the paperwork. The numbers nearly made me whistle. Grandma had quietly donated a substantial portion of her assets. Not enough to leave herself struggling, but enough to make a difference for generations. You did all this by yourself, she smiled. I had help. From who? A lot of good people. For several moments I just sat there, stunned. My parents thought they were fighting over a fortune. In reality, much of that fortune had already been dedicated to helping others. Not hidden. Not secret, simply unnoticed, because nobody had bothered asking what Grandma cared about. They only cared about what she owned. Then I found another document. This one caught my attention immediately. It was a revised estate plan. Recent. Very recent. Signed only 3 months earlier. I began reading. The house would eventually be sold. The proceeds would support the foundation. Some money would still go to family members. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. I read them twice to make sure I understood. Then a third time. And finally I laughed. A genuine laugh. The first one I'd had all day. What? Grandma asked. I looked up. This is brilliant. She pretended innocence. I don't know what you mean. You absolutely know what I mean. The conditions weren't cruel. They weren't vindictive. They weren't even particularly difficult. But they revealed exactly who my grandmother was. Anyone receiving money from the estate had to complete community service. They had to participate in veteran support programs. They had to attend financial responsibility workshops. And they had to provide proof. No shortcuts. No exceptions. No excuses. I couldn't stop smiling. This is your revenge." Grandma shook her head. "No." "Then what is it?" "A lesson." That answer sounded much more like the woman who raised me. A woman who believed character mattered more than wealth. A woman who spent her life helping people become better versions of themselves. Not because she enjoyed controlling others, because she understood something many people forget. Money amplifies character. If you're generous, money makes you more generous. If you're selfish, money often makes you more selfish. Grandma had seen enough of life to know the difference. We spent another hour reviewing paperwork. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. My grandmother wasn't reacting emotionally. She wasn't scrambling. She wasn't vulnerable. She had planned responsibly. Everything was legal. Everything was organized. Everything was documented. In typical military fashion, she had prepared years in advance, not for revenge, for stewardship. There was a difference. Then her expression changed. The smile disappeared. The sadness returned. I knew something else was bothering her. "What is it?" She hesitated. Then she answered. "They've been pressuring me." I sat upright. "What kind of pressure?" "Sign this. Sign that. Think about your future. Think about what's best." Her voice remained calm, but I could hear the hurt underneath. The disappointment. The loneliness. They keep acting like I've already lost the ability to make decisions. That hit me harder than I expected, because many older Americans know exactly what that feels like. The moment people stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a problem, a responsibility, a burden, an obstacle. Did they ask directly for money?" Grandma laughed softly. "Oh yes." "How direct?" She looked toward the living room. "Very." I shook my head. Part of me wanted to march in there and confront all three of them immediately. But another part understood what Grandma was trying to accomplish. She didn't need me to fight. She needed me to witness, to see the truth clearly. As if on cue, voices drifted into the kitchen. My father, Uncle Ray, my mother. They were returning. Grandma quickly gathered the documents, not because she was hiding them, because she wasn't ready yet. The time would come, but not today. A few minutes later, everyone sat around the dining room table. The atmosphere felt strange, artificial, like a family pretending everything was normal. My mother asked about my training assignment. Uncle Ray complained about gas prices. Dad talked about local politics. Meanwhile, nobody mentioned the paperwork scattered throughout the living room. Nobody mentioned assisted living. Nobody mentioned inheritance. The dishonesty was exhausting. Then my father turned toward Grandma. "We've been thinking." The words immediately put me on alert. Grandma remained calm. "Oh," he smiled. A salesman's smile. One I'd seen before. "We found a really nice retirement facility." Grandma took a sip of coffee. "Did you?" My mother jumped in. "They have activities. And transportation. And medical support." Uncle Ray nodded enthusiastically. "It would be perfect." I watched Grandma carefully. Her expression never changed. Years of military discipline hid whatever she was feeling. Then Dad pulled a folder from his briefcase. There it was. The real reason for the visit. Paperwork. He slid it across the table. "If you sign these, we can start making arrangements." The room became very quiet. I looked down. Property transfer forms. Exactly what I expected. My pulse quickened. I wanted to intervene. Grandma gently touched my arm beneath the table. A silent message. Not yet. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just knowingly. Almost as if she were watching a movie whose ending she already knew. She pushed the folder back toward my father. "Not today." His smile faded. "Mom, not today." The firmness in her voice surprised everyone, including me. For the first time all afternoon, my father looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. That evening, after everyone left, Grandma stood beside the front window watching their vehicles disappear down the street. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she turned toward me. "I think it's time." "Time for what?" Her eyes sparkled. Not with anger. With certainty. "The family meeting." I frowned. "What family meeting?" The smile returned. "The one they're never going to forget." And suddenly, I realized my grandmother wasn't planning revenge at all. She was preparing a reckoning, one built entirely on truth. For the next 2 weeks, I stayed in Ohio. Officially, I was using accumulated leave before returning to my next assignment. Unofficially, I was helping my grandmother prepare for what she called the family meeting. At first, I assumed she meant a gathering around the dining room table. A difficult conversation. An intervention. A confrontation. Something like that. I was wrong. Grandma had something much bigger in mind, and far more effective. The planning began the very next morning. We sat at her kitchen table with coffee and legal pads, the same table where I had found her crying. The difference was remarkable. The sadness hadn't disappeared completely, but now there was purpose, direction, strength. The woman I remembered was returning, not because her pain was gone, because she had decided what to do with it. Who should be there, I asked. Grandma thought carefully. People who know the truth. That answer sounded simple. It wasn't. Over the next hour, she created a list. Retired veterans, former patients, neighbors, church members, community volunteers, people whose lives she had touched over the years. The names filled several pages. I was amazed. At 78 years old, she had built relationships throughout the entire county. Not powerful relationships, meaningful ones. There was a difference. One name caught my attention. Harold Benson. I recognized it immediately. Colonel Benson. Grandma nodded. Retired now. I stared at her. The man had commanded thousands of troops during his career. What does he have to do with this? She smiled. I helped save his life once. I wasn't even surprised anymore. Every day seemed to reveal another story. Another person, another life she'd quietly changed. As the days passed, calls were made. Invitations extended. No details were shared. Only that Margaret Mitchell would appreciate their presence at a family gathering. The response amazed me. Almost everyone said yes, immediately. No hesitation. No questions, just yes. That alone told me everything. People respected her. Deeply. So, meanwhile, my parents and Uncle Ray continued their campaign. Phone calls increased. Visits became more frequent. Suggestions became pressure. Pressure became frustration. The more Grandma delayed signing documents, the more impatient they became. Fortunately, she had prepared me. Observe, she kept saying. Don't argue. So I observed. One afternoon, I sat quietly in the living room while my father tried once again. Mom, we're only thinking about your future. Grandma nodded politely. I know. You need support. I understand. You shouldn't be handling everything alone. Again, she nodded. Then she asked a simple question. If you're worried about me, when was the last time you asked what I wanted? The room became silent, painfully silent. My father opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't have an answer. Phew. Another day, Uncle Ray arrived carrying brochures. Luxury retirement communities, independent living facilities, assisted care centers. He spent nearly 40 minutes discussing amenities, swimming pools, restaurants, transportation, activities. Finally, Grandma interrupted him. Ray, what? Have you visited me even once this year without wanting something? The question landed like a hammer. His face turned red. He couldn't answer either. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Not because anyone was exposing it, because it exposed itself. People reveal themselves eventually, especially when money enters the conversation. The family meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after I found Grandma crying. The location surprised everyone. Instead of her house, she rented the community hall attached to the local Veterans Center. A modest building. Nothing fancy, but meaningful. Very meaningful. For decades, she had volunteered there. Many veterans considered her family. The day arrived. I arrived early to help with setup. Rows of chairs filled the hall. Coffee stations lined one wall. Photographs stood on display tables. Many came from the Foot Locker. Military photographs. Volunteer photographs, community events. Years of service captured in images. Looking around, I realized something. This wasn't a trial. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about inheritance anymore. It was about remembering. Guests began arriving shortly after noon. Then more. Then even more. By 1 o'clock, the room was nearly full. Veterans in caps and service jackets. Neighbors. Friends. Former co-workers. Church members. People from every chapter of Grandma's life. The crowd stunned me. I knew she was respected. I hadn't realized how much. Then my parents arrived, followed by Uncle Ray. The confusion on their faces was immediate. My mother looked around the crowded room. What is this? Nobody answered. Not yet. Dad spotted several local community leaders. His expression changed. Now he looked nervous. Good. Maybe for the first time he realized this wasn't going to be another private conversation. At precisely 1:30, Grandma stepped to the front of the room. The conversation stopped instantly. Not gradually. Instantly. That's the kind of respect she commanded. I felt proud just watching her. Straight posture, calm expression, quiet confidence. A retired Navy nurse standing before a room full of people whose lives she had touched. "Thank you for coming," she began. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room listened. Every word mattered. She welcomed everyone, thanked them. Then she invited several guests to speak. What followed changed everything. The first speaker was a veteran named Frank. He described meeting Grandma after returning home struggling with depression. She helped him find counseling. She checked on him regularly. She refused to give up on him. Quite honestly, he said, "I don't know if I'd still be here without Margaret." The room grew quiet. My father looked down. Then came a widow whose husband had served in Vietnam. Grandma had helped her navigate benefits paperwork after his death, for nearly a year, without charging a penny, without seeking recognition, without telling anyone. The woman cried while speaking. Several audience members cried with her. Story after story followed. A former patient, a single mother, a disabled veteran, a struggling family. Each person shared a memory, a kindness, a sacrifice, a moment when Margaret Mitchell had shown up when nobody else did. By the fifth story, my mother's eyes were wet. By the seventh, Uncle Ray couldn't look anyone in the eye. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the front carrying a folder. The same folder we had assembled from the footlocker. Financial records, loan documents, receipts, history, truth. I looked directly at my parents, then at my uncle. My voice remained calm, professional, measured. Years in the Navy had taught me discipline. Many people here know what Grandma has done for this community. I paused. But very few know what she's done for her family. The room became still, very still. I opened the folder and began reading. The first loan, the second, the third, the emergency bills she paid, the mortgages she helped save, the businesses she rescued, the tuition she funded, one example after another, year after year, decade after decade. No judgment, just facts, nothing but facts. And with every page I read, my parents seemed to shrink a little further into their chairs, because for the first time in their lives they were being forced to see the complete picture, not the version they preferred. The truth. And when I finally reached the last page, Grandma slowly rose to her feet. The room turned toward her. She looked at my parents, then at Uncle Ray, and finally she said 6 words that made the entire room hold its breath. "I've changed my estate plans. I've changed my estate plans." The room became so quiet that I could hear the old air conditioner humming near the back wall. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My father stared at Grandma. My mother looked confused. Uncle Ray's face went pale. For a brief moment I thought one of them might object. Instead, they simply sat there, waiting, just like everyone else, waiting to hear what would come next. Grandma stood calmly at the front of the room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. In fact, she looked surprisingly peaceful. That was the first thing I noticed. The woman who had been crying at her kitchen table 3 weeks earlier seemed completely different. Not because her pain had disappeared, because she had decided to face it. And there is a kind of strength that comes from that decision. A quiet strength. A permanent strength. The kind no one can take away. She looked around the room. At the veterans. At her neighbors. At her friends. Then finally at her children. My house will eventually be sold. Nobody reacted. That part wasn't surprising. My savings and remaining assets will be distributed according to the new estate plan. Still no reaction. Then she continued. The majority of my estate will support the Margaret Mitchell Veterans Service Foundation. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. My father blinked. What foundation? The question escaped before he could stop himself. Grandma turned toward him. The one I established 5 years ago. The expression on his face was unforgettable. Shock. Pure shock. He looked at my mother. My mother looked at Uncle Ray. Neither knew what she was talking about, because neither had ever asked. Grandma continued. The foundation will provide scholarships, emergency assistance, and housing support for veterans and military families. Several veterans nodded approvingly. One elderly man quietly wiped his eyes. The room understood exactly what this meant. Margaret Mitchell's service wasn't ending. It was continuing, long after she was gone. Then came the part that changed everything. Family members may still receive part of the estate. Relief immediately appeared on my father's face. Then Grandma finished the sentence, but only after meeting certain conditions. The relief vanished. My attorney stood and distributed copies of the estate documents. People began reading, slowly, carefully. The conditions were exactly as I remembered. Community service, volunteer work, veteran support programs, financial responsibility courses, proof of completion, real participation, not symbolic gestures, not signatures on paper, actual effort, actual service, actual growth. My father looked up first. "You're serious?" Grandma smiled gently. "Very." My mother spoke next. "Why would you do this?" The answer came immediately. "Because money without character is dangerous." Nobody argued. Nobody could. For the first time all afternoon, Uncle Ray stood. He looked uncomfortable, almost vulnerable. "I don't understand." Grandma nodded. "I know." His voice softened. "Do you think we're bad people?" The question surprised everyone, especially me, because it sounded honest. Not defensive, not angry, honest. Grandma thought for several seconds before answering. "No." The room remained silent. "No, Ray, I don't think you're bad people." "Then why?" Her eyes moved slowly across the room, toward all three of them. "You forgot what matters." That was it. Not greed, not evil, not cruelty. For years they had simply drifted. They had become focused on possessions, problems, bills, inheritance, the practical details of life, and somewhere along the way they forgot gratitude, forgot perspective, forgot people. Then Grandma said something I'll never forget. "The saddest thing isn't that you wanted my money." She paused. "The saddest thing is that none of you asked whether I was happy." Nobody looked at her, not one of them, because they knew she was right. Several people in the audience lowered their heads. A few quietly nodded, not because they were judging my family, because they recognized the truth. Many families experience some version of it. People get busy. Life gets complicated. Good intentions fade. Relationships become transactions. And sometimes nobody notices until damage has already been done. Then something unexpected happened. My mother started crying. Not dramatic tears, not attention-seeking tears, real tears. The kind that arrive when a person finally sees themselves clearly. She covered her mouth, shook her head, and whispered 3 words, "I'm sorry, Mom." The room remained silent. Grandma didn't rush to comfort her. She didn't rush to forgive her either. Instead, she allowed the moment to exist, allowed the truth to breathe. A few seconds later, my father stood. I had never seen him look so defeated. Not after losing jobs, not after financial struggles, not after difficult years. This was different. This wasn't failure. This was shame. And shame is harder, because it comes from within. "I thought we were helping." The words sounded weak even to him. Grandma nodded. "I believe part of you thought that." The honesty of her response stunned me. She wasn't trying to destroy him. She wasn't rewriting history. She was acknowledging complexity. Human beings are rarely entirely selfish, or entirely selfless. Usually we're both. At the same time, my father looked down, then slowly sat back in his chair. For the first time that day, he stopped defending himself, stopped explaining, stopped justifying, and simply listened. The meeting continued for nearly another hour. People shared memories. Questions were answered. Legal details were explained. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The inheritance was no longer the focus. Character was. Legacy was. Service was. The things Grandma cared about most. Eventually, the crowd began leaving. Veterans shook her hand. Neighbors hugged her. Friends thanked her. One by one, they departed. Until only family remained. Just the 5 of us. The hall suddenly felt much larger, much quieter. Nobody spoke for several moments. Then Uncle Ray finally broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Grandma nodded. Yes, it was such a simple response, yet somehow perfect. Not cruel, not dramatic, just honest. My mother moved first. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Grandma. Both women cried. Years of misunderstandings, years of assumptions, years of distance, not erased, but finally acknowledged. My father joined them a moment later. Then Uncle Ray. Soon all 4 stood together. A broken family trying to find its way back. Not fixed, not healed, but moving in the right direction. As I watched Grandma glance toward me, a small smile appeared. The same smile she wore the day she asked for revenge. And suddenly I understood. This had never been revenge. Not really. There were no winners, no losers, no destruction, no humiliation, just truth. Truth delivered with enough courage to change people. And perhaps that was the most powerful kind of revenge imaginable. Because instead of ruining her family, Grandma had forced them to confront themselves. And that was something none of them would ever forget. The months that followed surprised me. Not because everything suddenly became perfect. It didn't. Real life rarely works that way. People don't transform overnight. Families don't heal in a single conversation. Trust doesn't magically rebuild itself because someone says the right words. The damage had been real. The hurt had been real. And everyone knew it. But for the first time in a long time, something important had changed. We were finally being honest. I returned to active duty a few weeks after the family meeting. My next assignment took me back to Virginia. Life became busy again. Training schedules, administrative work, long days, early mornings, the usual rhythm of military life. But I spoke with Grandma nearly every evening, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Those conversations became the highlight of my day. The changes started slowly, so slowly that I almost missed them. One Saturday afternoon, my father called. That alone was unusual. We had always cared about each other, but we weren't particularly close. Not the way Grandma and I were. "Guess where I am?" he asked. "No idea." "The Veterans Center." I nearly dropped my phone. "The Veterans Center." "Yeah." I waited. I started volunteering. For several seconds I didn't know what to say. Then I smiled. "How's that going?" He laughed. Humbling. A few weeks later, Grandma told me something else. My mother had begun delivering meals to elderly residents in town. Every Tuesday. Without fail. Not because anyone forced her. Not because it was required by the estate plan. Because she wanted to. At first I assumed she was trying to impress Grandma. But months passed, and she kept doing it. Quietly. Consistently. The same way Grandma always had. Even Uncle Ray changed. Though in typical Uncle Ray fashion, he complained about it constantly. According to Grandma, he spent every volunteer shift grumbling. Every community project grumbling. Every veterans fundraiser grumbling. Yet somehow he never missed one. That made me laugh. Some people improve dramatically. Others improve while complaining the entire time. Both count. As the seasons changed, I noticed something else. Grandma smiled more. Not because she forgot what happened. She never did. But the weight she carried seemed lighter. The bitterness she feared had never taken root. That mattered. Because bitterness has a way of damaging the person carrying it. Grandma understood that better than anyone. The following spring, her health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things. Less energy, more doctor's appointments, longer naps, a slower pace. She remained independent, still stubborn, still sharp, still capable of winning any argument she chose to enter. But age was finally beginning to catch up with her. Whenever I had leave, I flew home, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes longer. Those visits became precious, because deep down both of us understood what was happening. We simply didn't say it out loud. One evening, nearly a year after the family meeting, we sat together on her front porch. The same porch where she used to drink coffee every morning. The sun was setting. The neighborhood was quiet. A warm summer breeze moved through the trees. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the evening settle across the town she loved. Then Grandma broke the silence. "Do you remember what I asked you that day?" I smiled. "Help me get revenge." She laughed softly. That wasn't my finest choice of words. "No. It got your attention, though." "It definitely got my attention." For a while she stared at the sunset. Then her expression became thoughtful. "Sarah." "Yes. I need you to remember something." Whenever Grandma used that tone, I listened carefully, because important lessons usually followed. People will disappoint you." I nodded. That wasn't exactly breaking news. Life had already taught me that. Sometimes they'll betray you. Another truth. A painful one. But that's not the important part. I waited. She turned toward me. Those familiar blue eyes remained as steady as ever. "The important part is what you do afterward." I didn't say anything. I wanted to hear every word. You can become angry. You can become cynical. You can spend the rest of your life trying to hurt people who hurt you." She paused. "Many people do." The evening breeze rustled the trees. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Then she reached over and squeezed my hand, the same way she had done on the day I found her crying. Only now there were no tears, no fear, no pain, just wisdom. "Don't become like them." The words landed gently, but powerfully. Even when people deserve it, I asked. She smiled. Especially then. I thought about my parents, about Uncle Ray, about the family meeting, about all the anger I had carried that day. And suddenly I understood what she meant. Justice mattered. Truth mattered. Accountability mattered. But becoming cruel in pursuit of those things came with a cost. A very high cost. One Grandma had refused to pay. Character, she said quietly, is what you choose when you're hurt. I knew immediately that I would remember that sentence for the rest of my life. 3 months later, Margaret Mitchell passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 79 years old. Her funeral filled the church. Veterans, neighbors, friends, community leaders, former patients, military families, people from every chapter of her remarkable life. Some traveled hundreds of miles to attend. Others stood outside because there wasn't enough room inside. I had never seen anything like it. During the service, story after story was shared. Stories of kindness, stories of sacrifice, stories of courage, stories of service. And as I listened, I realized something. The greatest thing Grandma left behind wasn't her house. It wasn't her savings. It wasn't even the foundation. It was the example she set. A life built on dignity, responsibility, compassion, and grace. Today the foundation continues its work. My father still volunteers. My mother still delivers meals. Uncle Ray still complains. And still shows up. The family isn't perfect. Never will be. But we're better than we were. Because one extraordinary woman refused to answer betrayal with hatred. If there's one lesson I carried from my grandmother's life, it's this. You cannot control how people treat you. You cannot control their choices. You cannot control their failures, but you can control who you become because of them. And sometimes the strongest victory isn't making people suffer. It's refusing to lose your character while seeking justice. If Margaret Mitchell's story touched you, take a moment to think about someone who shaped your life through kindness, sacrifice, or quiet strength. Maybe give them a call. Maybe thank them while you still can. And if this story reminded you of someone special, feel free to share it with others who might appreciate its message. Thank you for spending this time with me. And thank you for helping keep stories like my grandmother's alive. The ballroom went silent the moment I stepped through the doors. More than 200 people turned to look at me. Business executives, investors, employees, board members. And standing in the center of the room holding a champagne glass was my husband. Beside him stood a woman wearing a diamond necklace I had received on our 25th wedding anniversary. A necklace that was supposed to be locked inside my jewelry box at home. The woman smiled confidently until she saw me. Then the color drained from her face. My husband looked like he'd seen a ghost. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Who is that?" I straightened my shoulders inside my army dress uniform. 32 years of military service had taught me many things. How to stay calm under pressure. How to read people. How to wait patiently until the right moment. I looked directly at the woman, then at my husband. And finally I said the words that changed everything. "Hello, David." The room grew even quieter. "I'm Rebecca Carter." I paused. The actual Mrs. Carter. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. And in that moment, the carefully constructed lie my husband had been living for years began to collapse. But before I tell you how I ended up standing in that ballroom, I need to take you back 3 weeks. Back to the day I came home. I had spent 11 months overseas. At 58 years old, I was serving as a colonel in the United States Army and nearing retirement. Most people my age were planning vacations, spending time with grandchildren, or learning how to enjoy slower mornings. I was coordinating military operations halfway around the world. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly it was paperwork planning and responsibility. But I had always believed in service. And for more than 3 decades, my husband David had always claimed he believed in it too. Whenever I apologized for missing holidays or anniversaries, he would smile and tell me not to worry. "We both serve in different ways," he'd say. "You serve the country. I'll keep things running at home." For years I believed him. Maybe that's why what happened hurt so much. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because I never saw it coming. 3 weeks earlier, I received unexpected leave approval. My replacement arrived sooner than anticipated, which meant I could return to Texas almost a month earlier than planned. I decided not to tell David. I wanted to surprise him. The idea seemed romantic, old-fashioned maybe. The kind of thing married couples still did after 30 years together. I imagined showing up at his office, his face lighting up, a long embrace. Maybe dinner at our favorite steakhouse afterward. Simple things. The things you miss when you're away long enough. My flight landed at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on a bright Thursday morning. The Texas sun felt warmer than I remembered. I carried only a small bag and wore my army dress uniform because I was scheduled to attend a military ceremony the following day. Instead of heading home first, I called a rideshare and gave the driver the address of David's company, Carter Logistics Solutions, a business we had built together from almost nothing. Back in the early years, I had helped with bookkeeping on weekends while serving active duty. Every promotion I earned in the Army had also helped create opportunities for his growing business. We were partners, or at least I thought we were. The company headquarters occupied a modern 4-story building in a business district north of Dallas. As we pulled into the parking lot, I felt butterflies in my stomach. I remember laughing at myself. After 30 years of marriage, I was still nervous about surprising my husband. The driver dropped me off near the front entrance. I straightened my uniform jacket and walked toward the security desk. The guard looked to be in his late 20s, friendly enough. He smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am." "Morning," I said. "I'm here to surprise my husband." "Name?" "Rebecca Carter." He typed something into his computer, then glanced up. "Who are you meeting?" I smiled. "David Carter." The guard nodded. "And your relationship to Mr. Carter?" I actually laughed. "I'm his wife." The reaction caught me completely off guard. The young man laughed too. Not rudely at first, more like someone who thought he'd heard a joke. Then he shook his head. "Good one." I frowned. "I'm sorry." The guard leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am, the boss's wife is already inside." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood him. "The what?" "The boss's wife." He pointed toward the executive elevators. "She's here almost every day." I stared at him. My mind struggled to process what he was saying. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "There she is now." I turned. A woman in her 40s stepped out of the elevator lobby. Elegant dress, perfect hair, expensive handbag. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Several employees greeted her as she walked past. One man even said, "Morning, Mrs. Carter." "Mrs. Carter." My name, my title, my life. The woman smiled and continued walking toward the parking lot. The security guard looked back at me. See, my stomach tightened. I should have marched straight upstairs. Demanded answers. Created a scene, but military training kicked in. When something doesn't make sense, you don't react emotionally. You gather information. Observe first. Act second. I forced myself to smile. Interesting. The guard shrugged. "Sorry about the misunderstanding." I nodded politely. Then I walked back outside. The Texas heat hit me immediately. I sat down on a bench near the parking lot and watched the woman drive away. For nearly 20 minutes I remained there, thinking, breathing, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. The obvious explanation was an affair, but somehow it felt bigger than that. Employees weren't acting like she was a secret girlfriend. They genuinely believed she was Mrs. Carter, which meant this wasn't new. This had been happening for a while. A long while. I pulled out my phone. David had texted me 2 days earlier. "Miss you. Can't wait until you come home. Love you." I stared at the message. Then I looked back at the building. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered if I actually knew the man who had sent it. I stood up slowly. I wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. Instead, I booked a room at a nearby hotel. Because something told me that if I wanted the truth, I needed to stop being a wife for a little while and start thinking like an investigator. The moment I checked into that hotel room, I made a decision. I would not call David. I would not confront him. Not yet. Instead, I was going to find out exactly who that woman was, and why half of Dallas seemed to believe she was living my life. The first night in that hotel room, I barely slept. Not because I was angry. At least not yet. Anger requires certainty. And at that point, all I had were questions. I sat beside the window overlooking the Dallas skyline and replayed the scene at the security desk over and over. The guard hadn't looked nervous. He hadn't been covering for anyone. He genuinely believed the woman he pointed to was David Carter's wife. That was the part I couldn't shake. Affairs happen. I've lived long enough to know that. Military life puts enormous pressure on marriages. Long deployments, missed birthdays, empty chairs at family dinners. I've seen good marriages survive it and good marriages collapse under it. But what I'd witnessed wasn't simply infidelity. It was something stranger, more deliberate. Somehow another woman had stepped into my place so completely that people accepted her as Mrs. Carter, and nobody seemed to question it. Not even for a second. The next morning, I started doing what the Army had trained me to do for more than 30 years. Gather information. Patiently. Methodically. Without assumptions. I changed into civilian clothes and drove back to the company headquarters. This time I parked across the street. For nearly 4 hours, I sat inside a coffee shop with a view of the entrance. I watched employees arrive. I watched deliveries come and go. And around 9:30, I saw her. The woman. She arrived in a black Mercedes. A valet rushed to open her door. Several employees greeted her warmly. One even carried her handbag inside. Nobody treated her like a visitor. They treated her like family, like she belonged, like she was the boss's wife. Over the next 3 days, I continued watching. The pattern became impossible to ignore. She attended executive meetings, joined David for lunches, accompanied him to charity functions, walked through the building with complete authority. Everywhere she went, people called her Mrs. Carter. Not once did anyone correct themselves. Not once did anyone hesitate. It was as if I had never existed. On the 4th day, I decided to dig deeper. I started with social media. That alone nearly broke my heart. Photos. Hundreds of them. Fundraisers. Business dinners. Golf tournaments. Holiday parties. In photo after photo, David and the woman appeared together, standing side by side, smiling, posing, looking exactly like a married couple. Comments underneath the pictures were even worse. What a beautiful couple. You two are relationship goals. Mrs. Carter looks amazing. Nobody questioned it. Nobody knew. Or perhaps nobody cared. I stared at those images for hours. I wasn't jealous. At 58, jealousy felt like a young person's emotion. What I felt was something else. Erasure. As though the last 3 decades of my life had simply been deleted. That evening I called my oldest friend, Margaret. We'd met 27 years earlier at Fort Bragg. She retired as a lieutenant colonel and now lived outside San Antonio. Margaret answered on the second ring. Rebecca. Hey. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I hesitated. Then I told her everything. The security guard. The woman. The photographs. The lies. By the time I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. You're sure? I wish I wasn't. Another silence. Then she said something that stayed with me. Don't confront him. That's exactly what I was thinking. Good. I need facts. You always do. We both laughed softly. For the first time all week, I felt a little less alone. The next morning, Margaret connected me with another retired officer, a former military investigator named Frank Lawson. Frank was 72 years old and sharp as ever. After listening carefully, he asked only one question. Rebecca, do you believe this is only an affair? I thought about it. No. Neither do I. That answer surprised me. Why? Frank sighed. Because affairs thrive on secrecy. What does that mean? It means people hide them. I knew where he was going. This woman isn't hidden. Exactly. He paused. Someone wanted her seen. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. David wasn't merely cheating. He was presenting her as his wife, publicly, openly, repeatedly, for years. A few days later, I finally learned her name. Vanessa Morgan, 43 years old, former marketing consultant, divorced, no children. I found her listed as a board advisor for several local charities. Interestingly, many of those charities also received donations from David's company. The connections were growing, and I didn't like what I was seeing. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of my former neighbors called me unexpectedly. Karen had lived across the street from us for nearly 15 years. We hadn't spoken in months. After a few minutes of catching up, she asked a question that made my blood run cold. So when did you move out? I nearly dropped the phone. What? You and David. What are you talking about? There was a long pause. Karen sounded confused. I assumed you moved. Why? Because another woman has been staying there. I felt my heart pounding. How long? Another pause. Then she answered. At least 2 years. 2 years. Not 2 months. Not 6 months. 2 years. I closed my eyes. The room suddenly felt very small. For 2 years, another woman had been walking into my home, sleeping in my bed, using my kitchen, hosting dinners in the house I helped pay for, and all while I was serving overseas. That night I drove past my own house. I parked across the street. The same way I had watched The Office. The lights were on. A familiar porch light glowed beside the front door. The flower beds I had planted years earlier still lined the walkway. Everything looked exactly the same. yet somehow it wasn't my home anymore. At around 8:30, David's SUV pulled into the driveway. A few minutes later, Vanessa came outside. She kissed him. Casually, comfortably, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Then they went inside together. I sat there for nearly an hour, not crying, not screaming, just watching, accepting reality. Sometimes the truth arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives one painful piece at a time. For me, it was happening piece by piece, and each piece hurt more than the last. Back at the hotel, I spread documents, notes, and photographs across the bed. There was enough evidence now to prove David had built an entirely separate life, but something still bothered me. Something didn't add up. A successful businessman doesn't risk everything for an affair. Not unless there's something bigger behind it. Something financial. Something hidden. The next morning, I called a family attorney I had trusted for years. Her name was Lisa Reynolds. After hearing everything, she asked me to come to her office immediately. When I arrived, she listened quietly and reviewed my notes. Then she leaned back in her chair. "Rebecca, I think we need to examine the company's finances." I frowned. "Why?" Lisa folded her hands together. "Because people willing to lie this long about one thing," she paused, "are often lying about other things too." As I left her office that afternoon, I had a feeling my marriage wasn't the only thing about to fall apart. And deep down, I was beginning to suspect that David's betrayal went far beyond another woman. The following Monday morning, I sat across from Lisa Reynolds in her downtown Dallas office. The building overlooked a busy stretch of freeway where thousands of people were heading to work, worrying about deadlines, meetings, and ordinary problems. I envied them. A week earlier, I had been worried about whether David would like the surprise I had planned. Now I was trying to determine whether my husband had spent years dismantling the life we'd built together. Lisa slid a legal pad across the desk. "Let's start with everything you jointly own." For the next 2 hours, we reviewed our finances. The house, retirement accounts, investments, business interests, savings, things I hadn't thought about in years. David had always handled most of the company's financial operations, not because I couldn't, simply because marriage requires trust, or at least it should. I trusted him, the same way he trusted me to protect his life when I carried a weapon overseas, the same way he trusted me to represent our family while serving in uniform. Trust isn't supposed to be complicated. That's why betrayal hurts so much. By Wednesday, Lisa had assigned a forensic accountant to review publicly available records connected to Carter Logistics Solutions. His name was Michael Bennett, a quiet man in his 60s with reading glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He reminded me of a favorite high school teacher, the kind who notices details everyone else misses. When we met for the first time, he carried 3 thick folders. That immediately concerned me. 3 folders meant work, a lot of work. Michael sat down, opened the first folder, and sighed. "Colonel Carter." I hadn't heard that title spoken in days. For some reason, it comforted me. "Yes, I think you have a much bigger problem than an affair." My stomach tightened. "Show me." For the next hour, Michael walked me through a complicated web of transactions. Some were small, others weren't. Large consulting fees, questionable vendor contracts, property purchases, corporate transfers. At first glance, everything appeared legitimate. But once Michael began connecting the dots, a disturbing picture emerged. Money was moving. A lot of money. And much of it seemed connected to Vanessa Morgan. I stared at the documents. "How much are we talking about?" Michael adjusted his glasses. "Potentially several $1,000,000. The room suddenly felt colder. Several million. Not thousands. Not hundreds of thousands. Millions. I had expected heartbreak. I had expected lies. I had not expected financial betrayal on this scale. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Several companies receiving payments from Carter Logistics appeared to have connections to Vanessa. One was registered under a former business partner of hers. Another listed an address tied to a family member. A third had virtually no business activity at all, yet money continued flowing into it. Month after month, year after year. Lisa leaned forward. David knew exactly what he was doing. I nodded slowly. There was no other explanation. These weren't mistakes, they were decisions. Careful, intentional, calculated decisions. What hurt most wasn't the money. At 58 years old, I'd learned that money comes and goes. You can lose a house, lose investments, lose possessions. What truly hurts is discovering someone you love has been lying while looking directly into your eyes. That's harder to recover from. A few days later, Michael uncovered another troubling detail. David had recently begun restructuring ownership percentages within the company. The timing caught everyone's attention, especially Lisa's. She reviewed the paperwork several times before speaking. "When were you supposed to return from deployment?" "About 3 weeks from now." She nodded. "Interesting. What is—" Lisa turned the documents toward me. "These transfers were scheduled to continue over the next 6 months. I studied the dates. A cold realization settled over me. David thought he still had time. He believed I was overseas. He believed I wouldn't be back yet. Which meant he had been in the middle of something when I unexpectedly arrived home. Something unfinished. Something important. That weekend, another piece of the puzzle appeared. An old friend called me. His name was Jim Harper. He had worked for David for nearly 15 years before retiring. I'd always liked Jim. Steady. Honest. The kind of man who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards. When he heard I was back in Texas, he asked to meet for coffee. We chose a diner near Plano. Nothing fancy. Just eggs, coffee, and quiet conversation. After a few minutes of small talk, Jim grew serious. I almost didn't call. Why? He looked uncomfortable. Because I wasn't sure how much you knew. Knew about what? He stared into his coffee, then finally answered. "Things changed after you deployed." My heart sank. "What kind of things?" Jim sighed. "A lot of longtime employees left." That surprised me. David had always valued loyalty, or at least I thought he had. "Why?" Jim shook his head. "Most weren't fired." "Then what happened?" "They were pushed out." I frowned. "By who?" He looked directly at me. "Vanessa." For nearly an hour, Jim told me stories. Employees with decades of experience suddenly finding themselves excluded from meetings. Trusted managers being replaced. Longtime staff members resigning after conflicts with Vanessa. People who questioned her authority mysteriously disappearing from leadership positions. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Loyal employees were removed. Supporters were promoted. Little by little, Vanessa's influence grew. And David allowed it. Maybe even encouraged it. Then Jim shared something that cut deeper than everything else. Something I still remember word for word. We had finished eating. The waitress had refilled our coffee. Jim hesitated before speaking. "I probably shouldn't tell you this." "Tell me anyway." He looked away. "David used to make jokes." I felt a knot form in my chest. "What kind of jokes?" Jim swallowed, then quietly answered. "He'd say his wife loved the army more than she loved her marriage." For a moment I couldn't speak, not because I was shocked, because I was hurt, deeply hurt. I had missed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, family gatherings, not because I wanted to, because service required sacrifice. David knew that. He had supported that, or at least I believed he had. To hear that he had mocked those sacrifices behind my back felt worse than the affair itself, worse than the money, worse than the lies, because it meant he had rewritten our story, the story we'd spent 30 years building together. That night I sat alone in my hotel room. A photograph rested on the nightstand, one I had carried overseas. David and I standing together at my promotion ceremony years earlier. He had looked proud, genuinely proud, or maybe I had imagined it. Now I wasn't sure. I picked up the photograph and studied it for a long time, trying to figure out when everything changed, trying to identify the exact moment my husband stopped being my partner and became someone I no longer recognized. I never found the answer. The following week, Lisa called with news. "We're ready." I looked up from my notes. Ready for what? The next step. I knew exactly what she meant. For nearly 2 weeks we had gathered evidence, documents, financial records, witness statements, corporate filings, photographs, everything. Piece by piece we had assembled the truth, and now the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Lisa's voice remained calm. "Rebecca, if we're going to do this, we need to do it properly." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I agree." "David still doesn't know you're here." "No." "Good." That single word carried enormous weight. Good. Because surprise had become my greatest advantage. David thought I was thousands of miles away. He thought his secrets were safe. He thought he still controlled the narrative. What he didn't realize was that the evidence against him was already stacked neatly inside several folders sitting on my hotel desk. And very soon those folders were going to be opened in front of people whose opinions mattered far more than mine. People with the power to destroy everything he'd spent years trying to protect. The trap wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the truth. and the truth was finally ready to be revealed. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Not to me, of course. To investors, board members, business partners, and local media. David was hosting a celebration, a major company event announcing a new expansion project. The kind of event designed to attract attention. Photos, press coverage, public recognition, a victory lap. When Lisa showed me the invitation, I almost laughed. The timing couldn't have been more ironic. For years, David had carefully managed appearances. Now he was about to put all of his most important relationships into one room. Investors, board members, industry leaders, everyone whose trust he depended on. And he was doing it voluntarily. Sometimes people create their own downfall. They just don't realize it. The event was scheduled for a Friday evening at a luxury hotel in downtown Dallas. The ballroom could hold nearly 300 guests. According to Lisa, attendance would be impressive. Several major investors were expected. A few local politicians, business reporters, community leaders, the entire board of directors. Exactly the kind of audience David would want. And exactly the kind of audience that needed to hear the truth. The week leading up to the event felt strangely peaceful. Not because I wasn't nervous. I was. But after years in the army, I'd learned something important. Preparation reduces fear. And we were prepared. Every document had been reviewed. Every statement verified. Every piece of evidence organized. There would be no emotional outburst. No dramatic screaming. No scenes from a television show. Just facts. Carefully documented facts. The kind that are difficult to argue with. Snai. On Friday afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror inside my hotel room. My army dress uniform fit perfectly. The same uniform I had worn at promotion ceremonies, military funerals, retirement celebrations, and official functions across 3 decades. The uniform represented service, duty, integrity, values that had guided my life, values that suddenly felt more important than ever. I adjusted the ribbons above my pocket, smoothed my jacket, and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 3 weeks earlier, but she also looked stronger. There comes a point when heartbreak stops making you feel small. Instead, it reminds you who you are. That moment had finally arrived. Lisa met me in the hotel lobby. She carried a briefcase. Inside were copies of everything. Financial records, corporate filings, supporting documents. Enough evidence to answer every question that might arise. She smiled. "You ready?" I thought about it, then nodded. Yes. For the first time since returning home, I truly meant it. The ballroom was already crowded when we arrived. Through the partially open doors, I could hear laughter and conversation, glasses clinking, music playing softly, people celebrating. Inside, David was probably enjoying himself, confident, comfortable, completely unaware of what was about to happen. For a brief moment, I considered turning around, not because I was afraid, because part of me still loved the man I had married. 30 years doesn't disappear overnight. Even after betrayal, even after lies, a small piece of my heart wished none of this had happened. But wishes don't change reality. Truth does. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room didn't notice me immediately. Why would they? I was simply another guest entering a crowded ballroom. But as I moved farther inside, heads began turning. People noticed the uniform first. Then they noticed me. Several older employees looked confused, as if they recognized something familiar but couldn't quite place it. I continued walking, steady, calm, purposeful, toward the stage, toward David. He was standing near the front of the room holding a champagne glass. Beside him stood Vanessa. She wore an elegant navy blue dress. Around her neck hung the diamond necklace David had given me on our 25th anniversary. The sight still hurt, but not as much as it would have a week earlier. By then I had already accepted the truth. The necklace was merely a symbol. The real betrayal ran much deeper. Then David saw me. I watched the exact moment recognition appeared. His smile vanished. The color drained from his face. The champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. For several seconds he simply stared, as if his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Vanessa noticed his reaction. Then she turned, and saw me too. Her expression shifted immediately. Confidence, confusion, fear, all within a few seconds. The room grew quieter. Conversations began fading. People sensed something unusual was happening. I stopped a few feet away, close enough for David to hear every word, far enough to maintain dignity. Neither of us spoke initially. The silence itself was powerful. Finally, I broke it. "Hello, David." His mouth opened slightly. No sound emerged. I had seen soldiers react more calmly during emergencies. "Oh." A few guests exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" I looked around the room, at the employees, the investors, the board members, the people who deserved honesty. Then I answered the question myself. "My name is Rebecca Carter." More silence. I continued. "I've been married to David Carter for 30 years. The reaction was immediate. Several people visibly stiffened. Others looked toward Vanessa, then back toward me. Confusion spread through the room, a ripple moving from table to table. I glanced at the necklace, then at Vanessa. "I'm also the woman who received that necklace from my husband on our 25th wedding anniversary." Vanessa instinctively touched it, as though suddenly aware everyone was looking. David finally found his voice. "Rebecca." It was barely a whisper. I turned toward him. "No." My tone remained calm. "Tonight isn't about explanations." The room remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. One of the board members approached cautiously, an older gentleman named Robert Simmons. I recognized him from company photographs. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes." His expression tightened. "I think perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere private." I shook my head gently. Ordinarily, I would agree. Then I looked toward the board members seated nearby. "But the information I'm about to share affects this company." Robert immediately understood. His face grew serious, very serious. Lisa stepped forward. She opened her briefcase, removed several folders, and handed copies to key board members. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was business. For the next 20 minutes, Lisa calmly presented evidence. Financial transfers, questionable consulting agreements, corporate transactions connected to Vanessa, documentation, dates, amounts, records. No accusations, just facts. The room became quieter with every page. Board members exchanged increasingly concerned looks. Investors began asking questions. The answers were not reassuring. I never raised my voice, never insulted David, never attacked Vanessa. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke far more effectively than anger ever could. One board member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another requested immediate access to additional financial records. A third quietly asked corporate counsel to join the discussion. The celebration had transformed into an emergency meeting. David stood frozen through most of it, his carefully constructed image collapsing in real time. Not because I destroyed it, because the truth did. Eventually he looked at me. For the first time all evening I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of embarrassment, fear of consequences, real consequences. Professional, financial, legal. Consequences he could no longer avoid. And as I looked around that ballroom, I realized something important. This wasn't revenge. Not anymore. Revenge is about making someone suffer. What was happening here was accountability. And accountability had finally arrived. By the end of the evening, the board had scheduled an emergency investigation. Outside auditors would be brought in. Corporate records would be reviewed. Nothing would remain hidden. As guests slowly left the ballroom, I watched David standing alone near the stage. For the first time in 30 years, he looked like a stranger. And deep down, I knew his biggest losses hadn't even begun yet. The investigation began the following Monday. Unlike television dramas, real investigations move slowly. There are no dramatic music cues, no surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Just long hours, documents, interviews, accountants, lawyers, questions, and eventually answers. For the first time since returning home, I checked out of the hotel and rented a small furnished apartment near a lake outside Dallas. I needed distance. Distance from David. Distance from our house. Distance from everything that had once felt familiar. Every morning I would sit on a small balcony with coffee and watch ducks move across the water. It was peaceful, at least on the surface. Inside I still felt like someone rebuilding after a storm. Within 2 weeks, the board suspended David from his leadership position, pending the outcome of the investigation. The announcement made local business news. Several major investors demanded explanations. Some business partners paused negotiations. Others quietly walked away. Trust is difficult to earn, easy to lose, and nearly impossible to recover once people believe you've been dishonest, especially in business. I wasn't attending board meetings, but Lisa kept me informed. The findings grew worse with each report. Some of the financial transfers had violated company policies. Several contracts should never have been approved. Corporate funds had been used in ways that raised serious concerns. While criminal charges were never discussed, civil liability quickly became a possibility. The board's priority was protecting the company. And protecting the company meant protecting it from David. Vanessa disappeared almost immediately. That part surprised me less than anything else. One week she was attending charity luncheons and posing for photographs. The next week she was nowhere to be found. No social media updates, no public appearances, no company events. Gone. As if someone had switched off a light. People who had once praised her suddenly avoided mentioning her name. Funny how quickly loyalty changes when money and status disappear. One afternoon I received a call from Jim Harper. "Have you heard? Heard what?" Vanessa left town. I wasn't shocked. Where'd she go? No idea. I looked out toward the lake. Do you think she ever loved him? The question surprised even me. Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he answered carefully. I honestly don't know. Neither did I. And strangely enough, it no longer mattered. 3 months after the investigation began, the board reached its decision. David would no longer lead Carter Logistics Solutions. His ownership interests would be significantly reduced under a settlement agreement. Additional legal proceedings would resolve the remaining financial disputes. The company survived, but David's position within it did not. When Lisa called with the news, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Very tired. Because the truth is, winning doesn't always feel the way people imagine, especially when the person who loses is someone you once loved. The financial settlement itself was substantial. Years of shared assets, business interests, property, investments, everything had to be divided. The final numbers weren't important to me. Not really. I had spent most of my adult life living comfortably but modestly. The settlement provided security. Nothing more. And honestly, security was enough. At my age, peace mattered more than luxury. Friends wanted me to celebrate. Margaret certainly did. She drove up from San Antonio and insisted on taking me to dinner. Halfway through the meal, she raised a glass. To Rebecca Carter, I laughed. What exactly are we celebrating? You survived. That answer caught me off guard. Margaret smiled. No bitterness, no revenge obsession, no self-destruction. She lifted her glass again. You survived. This time I raised mine too, because maybe she was right. A few weeks later, I received a text message from David. The first direct message since the ballroom. Would you meet me? I stared at the phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part knew avoidance wouldn't bring closure. Eventually, I agreed. Oh. We met at a quiet restaurant outside the city. The kind of place where retired couples linger over coffee and nobody pays attention to strangers. When David walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. Thank you for coming. I nodded. You're welcome. Then another silence settled between us. 30 years together, and suddenly we felt like strangers. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. His eyes closed briefly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. For the next hour, David told me things I should have heard years earlier. Not excuses. Not justifications. Truth. Or at least what he believed was the truth. He talked about feeling overshadowed. About insecurity. About watching people admire my military career while viewing him simply as my husband. At first, I struggled to understand. Then I remembered something important. Pain doesn't always make people stronger. Sometimes it makes them selfish. I was proud of you, he said quietly. Then why did you mock me? His face tightened. He knew exactly what I meant. Jim's story. The jokes. The comments. David looked ashamed. Because it was easier. Easier than what? Easier than admitting I felt left behind. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. I convinced myself you loved the army more than you loved me. I stared at him. You knew that wasn't true. I know that now. The answer was heartbreaking. Because deep down, I think he knew it then too. Boom. People often imagine betrayal comes from hatred. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it comes from weakness, insecurity, fear. Poor choices repeated over and over until they become something unforgivable. That realization didn't excuse what David had done, but it helped me understand it. And understanding is often the first step toward peace. As lunch ended, David looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. The first I'd seen throughout this entire ordeal. I'm sorry, Rebecca. The words hung in the air. Simple words, Late words, but sincere words. I believed that. For a long moment I studied the man sitting across from me. The man I had loved. The man who had broken my heart. The man who had ultimately destroyed his own life far more thoroughly than I ever could have. And for the first time since coming home, I didn't feel anger. I felt sadness. A deep sadness for everything we had lost. Everything we could have been. And everything that would never be again. As we stood to leave, David asked one final question. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I looked at him carefully, then answered honestly, "I don't know." And at that moment, it was the most truthful answer I could give. 6 months after my meeting with David, I officially retired from the United States Army. 32 years. When I first raised my right hand and took the oath, I was 26 years old. I had no idea where life would take me. I certainly never imagined I would end my career as a colonel. And I definitely never imagined I would be retiring while rebuilding my life from the ground up. Life has a way of surprising us. Not always pleasantly, but sometimes the unexpected becomes the beginning of something better. The retirement ceremony was held on a warm spring afternoon. Family, friends, fellow soldiers, former commanders, people from different chapters of my life gathered together. Margaret sat in the front row. Jim was there too. Even Lisa attended. As I looked around the room, I noticed something interesting. For months I had focused on what I had lost. A marriage, a home, a future I thought was guaranteed. But standing there that afternoon, I saw something else. I saw what remained. Friendship, respect, community, purpose. The things that truly matter. The things betrayal cannot take away. After the ceremony, several younger officers approached me. They asked questions about leadership, service, retirement, life after the military. One young captain looked particularly nervous. "Ma'am," she said, "what's the most important thing you've learned?" I smiled. There were hundreds of possible answers, but only one felt right. Never build your entire identity around one person. She nodded thoughtfully. I hoped she understood, because it had taken me nearly 60 years to learn that lesson myself. A few weeks later, I began volunteering with a veterans transition program. The organization helped former service members adjust to civilian life. Many struggled with uncertainty. Some felt lost. Others felt forgotten. I understood those feelings better than I ever expected to. Every Wednesday, I met with veterans looking for jobs, housing, or simply someone willing to listen. The work was meaningful and surprisingly healing. Helping other people reminded me that pain isn't the end of a story. Sometimes it's the beginning of a new chapter. See you. One afternoon, nearly a year after returning home, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text message, a handwritten letter. The envelope carried a familiar name, David Carter. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. The letter was only 3 pages long. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify his choices, no requests to get back together. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that should have existed years earlier. He wrote about regret, about accountability, about therapy, about learning to accept responsibility instead of blaming others. Most importantly, he wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for the years we shared. Gratitude for the sacrifices I made. Gratitude for the life we built before everything fell apart. When I finished reading, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to forget it, because I wanted to remember it. People often ask whether I ever forgave David. The answer is yes, eventually I did. But probably not for the reason most people expect. I didn't forgive him because he deserved it. Forgiveness isn't a reward. I forgave him because carrying bitterness was exhausting. Anger is heavy. Resentment is heavy. At some point, you realize you're carrying a burden that belongs to someone else, and you finally decide to set it down. That doesn't mean I forgot. It doesn't mean I trusted him again. And it certainly doesn't mean we got back together. We didn't. Some chapters are meant to end. But endings don't have to be cruel. Sometimes they can simply be final. A few months later, David and I met one last time. Not to discuss legal matters. Not to revisit the past. Just coffee. 2 people acknowledging a shared history. Nothing more. We talked about ordinary things. Mutual friends. Retirement. Health. Life. When the conversation ended, neither of us cried. Neither of us argued. We simply wished each other well. And that was enough. Not every story requires a dramatic conclusion. Sometimes peace arrives quietly. Today, as I tell this story, I'm sitting at a community event hosted by the Veterans Organization where I volunteer. Children are playing nearby. Families are gathered around picnic tables. Old soldiers are sharing stories. The sun is beginning to set. It's a good day. A peaceful day. The kind of day I once feared I would never have again. A few years ago, I believed my story was ending. Now I realize it was only changing direction. Looking back, people sometimes describe what happened as revenge. I understand why. There was a public revelation. There were consequences. David lost the company he worked so hard to build. His reputation suffered. His relationship with Vanessa collapsed. From the outside, it probably looks like revenge. But that's not how I see it. The greatest revenge wasn't exposing him. It wasn't winning a settlement. It wasn't watching his lies unravel. The greatest revenge was refusing to let his betrayal define the rest of my life. That's what truly mattered. Because when someone hurts you deeply, there is always a choice. You can spend years living inside that wound. Or you can keep moving forward. Slowly. Painfully. One step at a time. Until the wound becomes a scar. And the scar becomes part of your story instead of your identity. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my experience, it's this. The truth may arrive later than you want. Justice may take longer than you expect. And healing may happen more slowly than you'd like. But none of those things are impossible. As long as you keep going. As long as you keep choosing dignity over bitterness. As long as you remember that another person's betrayal does not determine your worth. See? Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. If this journey reminded you of someone you've loved, forgiven, or lost, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on that person today. And if you've ever faced betrayal and found a way to move forward with grace, know that you're not alone. Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences. Stories have a way of helping us heal together. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and second chances, I invite you to join us again for another journey. Take care of yourself, and remember, sometimes the best years of your life are still waiting ahead.